Today, I, good old Texas boy, am going to walk you through 3 true stories that prove something evil lives in the Appalachians. Before we dive into these chilling tales, I'd love for you to share where you're from and what time it is where you are right now. It's always fascinating to see how far these evil stories can reach. Now, settle in, relax, and let's get started. The radio died at 3:17 a.m. Marcus had been driving for 6 hours straight, threading his rental car through the narrow mountain roads of eastern Kentucky. The oldies station cut to static mid-song, leaving him alone with the sound of his tires on wet asphalt and rain drumming against the windshield. He reached for the dial, scanning through empty frequencies, nothing but white noise, and the occasional fragment of what might have been voices too distant and warped to understand. He'd made this drive once before, 23 years ago, when his grandmother was dying. Now she was 3 days buried, and he was coming back to clean out her house before the bank took it. The funeral had been small. Just him, a few neighbors he didn't recognize, and a preacher who kept calling her Martha when her name was Mabel. Marcus had corrected him once, then given up. Nobody else seemed to notice. The headlights swept across a familiar green sign, Millfield, 12 miles. His stomach tightened. 12 more miles of winding through these mountains where the trees pressed so close to the road they formed a tunnel overhead, blocking out what little moonlight filtered through the storm clouds. He'd forgotten how dark it got out here, how the darkness seemed to have weight. His phone had lost signal an hour ago, not that he'd expected anything different. The mountains swallowed cell towers the same way they swallowed everything else, slowly, patiently, until you forgot there was ever anything beyond them. Marcus remembered being 17 and desperate to leave, counting down the days until graduation, until college, until anywhere that wasn't Millfield. He'd succeeded, too. Built a life in Atlanta, married Sarah, bought a house with good schools nearby for the kids they'd planned to have someday. Those plans felt very far away now. The divorce papers were still in his briefcase, signed but not yet filed. Sarah had been patient, more patient than he deserved, but even she had limits. "You're already gone," she'd said the night she asked him to move out. "You've been gone for months. I'm tired of living with a ghost." She wasn't wrong. Ever since his promotion to regional manager, Marcus had been working 12-hour days, coming home exhausted and empty. He told himself it was temporary, that he was building something for their future, but the truth was simpler and uglier. Work was easier than marriage. Spreadsheets didn't ask how your day was or why you'd been so distant lately. They just needed to be filled out. Problem solved, file closed. Now here he was, driving through the mountains he'd spent half his life trying to forget, carrying 3 days' worth of clothes and no clear plan for what came next. The road curved sharply to the left, and his headlights swept across something that made him hit the brakes. A house sat back from the road, barely visible through the trees. Every window was lit up, golden light spilling out into the darkness. It looked warm and welcoming, the kind of place where people gathered around kitchen tables and actually talked to each other. But that was impossible. This stretch of Route 23 had been abandoned for decades. He remembered his grandmother telling stories about the families who used to live up in these hollows, before the coal company bought them out and the young people all moved away. The houses had been left to rot, claimed by kudzu and time. Marcus slowed the car, squinting through the rain. The house was definitely there, definitely occupied. He could see shadows moving behind the lit windows, figures that might have been people. As he watched, someone walked across what looked like a living room, backlit by warm lamplight. He almost stopped, almost pulled into the muddy driveway to ask for directions, or just to see another human face after hours of empty road. But something held him back, a prickle of unease he couldn't name. The house looked too perfect, too untouched by the decay that had claimed everything else in these mountains. And the light had a strange quality to it, too steady and golden, like it was coming from candles or oil lamps instead of electric bulbs. Marcus pressed the gas pedal and kept driving. In his rearview mirror, the house faded back into the darkness between the trees. 5 minutes later, he passed another house. This one was obviously abandoned. Roof caved in, windows broken, vines growing through the gaps where the porch used to be. It sat in the exact same spot where the lit house had been, at the exact same angle to the road. Marcus pulled over, hands shaking slightly as he put the car in park. He turned to look back through the rear window, but the darkness was absolute. No lights, no house, no sign that anything had ever been there, except the rotten shell of what used to be someone's home. He sat there for a long time, listening to the rain and the sound of his own breathing. Then he put the car back in drive and continued toward Millfield, trying to convince himself that he'd been more tired than he thought, that his eyes had played tricks on him, or that there had been two houses and he'd gotten confused about which was which. But he knew what he'd seen, and somewhere in the back of his mind a small voice was whispering that he should turn around, that he should drive back to Atlanta tonight, leave his grandmother's house to the bank and the memories to the mountains. Instead, he drove on, because that's what Marcus did. He pushed through, he handled things, he solved problems even when the problems didn't make sense. The radio crackled back to life as he crested the next hill. Not music this time, but voices. Low, indistinct, like people having a conversation in the next room. He turned up the volume, trying to make out the words, but they remained just beyond understanding. The voices had a strange cadence, rising and falling in patterns that almost sounded like a song. As he descended into the valley where Millfield waited, the voices grew clearer. Not clear in the sense that he could understand them. The words, if they were words, remained foreign. But he could hear the emotion beneath them now. Sadness, deep and ancient. Loss that had been carried for generations. And underneath it all, something that sounded almost like calling. Like the voices were trying to get someone's attention, trying to bring someone home. Marcus reached for the radio dial to change the station, but stopped when he realized something that made his blood go cold. The voices weren't coming from the radio at all. The display still showed static, empty frequencies scrolling past as he turned the dial. The voices were coming from outside the car, from the mountains themselves. He rolled down the window, and they became unmistakably clear. Not words in any language he recognized, but definitely human voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They seemed to come from everywhere at once. From the trees, from the rocky outcroppings, from the darkness between the hills. And they were all calling the same thing. A name, repeated over and over in harmonies that made his chest ache with loneliness. They were calling his name. Marcus rolled the window back up and pressed harder on the gas pedal. The speedometer climbed to 50, then 60, faster than anyone should drive on these mountain roads. But he needed to get to town, needed to be around electric lights and other people. needed to prove to himself that the world still made sense. The voices followed him all the way down the mountain, growing louder and more insistent with every mile. By the time he reached the outskirts of Millfield, they were so loud he had to turn the radio up full volume just to drown them out. But when he finally pulled into the parking lot of the Millfield Motel, the only business that still had its lights on at this hour, the voices stopped as suddenly as if someone had thrown a switch. The silence that followed was worse than the calling had been. The map was wrong. Sarah Chin had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for 6 days, following the detailed topographical maps that had guided thousands of other backpackers safely through these mountains. But according to her GPS and every landmark she could identify, she was currently standing in a valley that didn't exist. She set her pack down beside a fallen log and spread the map across her knees, checking and rechecking the coordinates. The trail was supposed to continue straight through this section, following a ridgeline between 2 documented peaks. Instead, she'd found herself descending into a narrow hollow that wasn't marked on any of her maps, guided by white blazes that had appeared on the trees as clearly as any official trail marker. The blazes were the problem. She'd been following them for 2 days now, trusting them the way every hiker learned to trust the white rectangles painted on trees to mark the official trail. But these blazes were different in subtle ways, slightly larger, painted in a shade of white that seemed to glow with its own light, even in deep shade. And they led places the real trail had never gone. Sarah had been section hiking the AT for 3 years, ever since her diagnosis. Stage 3 breast cancer, caught late because she'd been too busy building her cartography business to notice the signs her body had been trying to give her for months. The chemotherapy had worked. She'd been clear for 18 months now, but it had left her feeling disconnected from her own life, like she was looking at everything through glass. The hiking helped. Out here, with nothing but the trail ahead and the weight of her pack reminding her that her body was still strong, still capable, she could remember who she'd been before the cancer tried to rewrite her story. The mountains didn't care about her medical history or her fears about recurrence. They only cared whether she was smart enough and prepared enough to respect them. But now, the mountains were lying to her, and that was something she couldn't understand. She'd first noticed the discrepancies 3 days ago, when her planned campsite, a designated shelter marked clearly on her maps, simply wasn't there. Instead of the 3-sided wooden structure she'd expected, she'd found only a foundation of old stone, so overgrown with moss and ferns that she almost missed it entirely. The coordinates were exact. The surrounding landmarks matched perfectly, but the shelter had apparently been gone for decades. That night, she'd camped nearby and told herself it was just outdated information. Trail structures got damaged by storms or rebuilt in new locations. Her maps were 2 years old. Maybe the shelter had been relocated and she just hadn't downloaded the update. But then, the phantom blazes had appeared, leading her off the documented trail and into terrain that shouldn't exist. She'd followed them because they looked official, because years of hiking had trained her to trust the white marks, even when her instincts said something was wrong. Now, she was lost, not just geographically, but in a way that made her question everything she thought she knew about navigation and maps and the mountains themselves. The valley around her was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at. Old-growth trees towered overhead, their trunks so massive she couldn't have wrapped her arms around them. Wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion despite the deep shade, creating carpets of color that shifted and swirled in patterns that almost looked deliberate. A stream ran through the center of the valley, its water so clear she could see individual pebbles on the bottom 20 feet down. It was the kind of place that should have been documented, photographed, turned into a tourist destination. The kind of hidden valley that nature writers spent their careers trying to find and describe. But according to every map she carried, official and unofficial, it simply wasn't here. Sarah pulled out her GPS unit and watched the satellite signal strength fluctuate wildly. One moment, it showed her coordinates with perfect accuracy. The next, it couldn't find any satellites at all. Her location jumped around the screen like a glitch, placing her simultaneously in 3 different states, and at one point, briefly, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. She turned the unit off and on again, but the problem persisted. Either the device was malfunctioning, unlikely since she'd bought it specifically for this trip and tested it thoroughly, or something about this valley was interfering with satellite signals in ways that shouldn't be possible. As a cartographer, Sarah understood better than most people how maps were constructed, how satellite imagery was processed, how geographic information systems translated the messy reality of the world into clean, usable data. She knew the limitations and margins of error, the ways that technology could fail or be fooled. But she also knew that entire valleys didn't just hide from satellites, that trails didn't appear and disappear based on who was walking them, that the fundamental relationship between the territory and the map was supposed to be stable, predictable, trustworthy. Standing in this impossible valley, those certainties felt as fragile as her GPS signal. She decided to make camp for the night and reassess in the morning. Maybe her perspective would be clearer after some sleep and food. Maybe she'd be able to find her way back to the official trail and chalk this up to fatigue and stress and the lingering effects of chemotherapy on her concentration. As she set up her tent beside the crystal-clear stream, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. The ground where she was laying out her sleeping pad was perfectly level and clear of debris, as if someone had prepared a campsite here. But when she looked more closely, she realized the clearing was natural. Not a single tree or large rock within the precise boundaries of where a tent would fit, while the forest pressed close on all sides. It was as if the valley had been expecting her. The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the evening air. Sarah had camped alone dozens of times over the years, and she'd never felt unsafe in the mountains. Wary of weather and wildlife, yes, but never afraid of the landscape itself. The woods had always felt neutral to her, indifferent to human presence, but not actively hostile. This place felt different, not hostile exactly, but aware, like it was watching her with the patient attention of something very old and very intelligent. As darkness fell, the feeling intensified. The normal sounds of the forest, insects, small animals moving through the underbrush, the wind in the trees, were muted here as if the valley existed inside a bubble of stillness. Instead, she heard other things. Footsteps that stopped whenever she listened for them. Voices that might have been the stream talking to itself, or might have been something else entirely. And once, just as she was drifting off to sleep, she heard her own voice calling her name from somewhere across the valley. Not an echo. She hadn't spoken aloud, but her exact voice, with her exact inflection, calling, "Sarah," in a tone of urgent concern. She sat up in her tent, heart pounding, and called back, "Who's there?" Her voice echoed off the valley walls. multiplying and overlapping until it sounded like a dozen Sarahs all calling out in confusion and fear. The echoes went on far longer than they should have in a space this size, bouncing back and forth until they became a chorus, then fading so gradually she couldn't tell when they finally stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the stream seemed to have gone quiet. Sarah lay awake for the rest of the night, staring up at stars that looked subtly wrong, familiar constellations twisted into new configurations, as if she was seeing them from a different angle than should have been possible from her geographic location. When morning came, she packed quickly and began searching for a way out of the valley, but every path she tried led deeper in. Even when she was certain she was walking uphill toward the rim, the white blazes appeared wherever she needed them, marking trails that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. By midday, she'd accepted the impossible truth. The valley didn't want to let her go. The question was whether it ever intended to. The funeral was supposed to be closed casket. Daniel Hawkins had made that very clear to the funeral director when he'd made the arrangements 3 days earlier. His great-aunt Cordelia had been 93 when she died. Found in her cabin after the mailman noticed a week's worth of uncollected letters. The mountain heat and time had not been kind to her remains. But now, standing in the front pew of Crossroads Baptist Church, Daniel was staring at an open casket containing a woman who looked like she'd died peacefully in her sleep, maybe an hour ago. Her face was serene, her silver hair neatly arranged, her hands folded over a dress he'd never seen, but somehow looked exactly like something she would have chosen. She looked better than she had in years. The funeral director, Mr. Garrett, caught Daniel's confused stare and hurried over. "I hope you don't mind," he whispered. "When we went to prepare her yesterday, we found, well, she was in much better condition than we'd expected. Seemed a shame to keep the casket closed when folks could have a chance to say goodbye properly." Daniel nodded numbly, though nothing about this made sense. He'd been in the cabin when they found her. He'd seen what a week in the August heat had done. The woman in the casket bore no resemblance to the remains they'd carried out on a stretcher, wrapped in sheets and loaded quickly into the coroner's van. But here she was, looking like she was only sleeping. Looking, if he was honest, younger than he'd seen her in the past decade. The deep lines around her eyes had softened, the arthritic hunch of her shoulders had straightened, and there was color in her cheeks that spoke of health, rather than the rouge funeral directors use to give corpses the illusion of life. "She looks peaceful," said a voice behind him. Daniel turned to see Mrs. Emerson, who'd lived in the next hollow over from Aunt Cordelia for 50 years. Like she finally found what she was looking for. That was an odd thing to say. But then Mrs. Emerson had always been odd. She was one of the old mountain people, the kind who still believed in things that didn't have names in the modern world. Daniel had heard her and his great-aunt talking sometimes when he'd visited as a child, speaking in the kind of hushed tones adults used when they didn't want children to understand the subject matter. "What do you mean?" Daniel asked. Mrs. Emerson studied his face for a moment, as if trying to decide whether he was ready for whatever she might tell him. "Your great-aunt spent a long time waiting," she said finally. "Longer than most folks would have. But I reckon she knew you'd come back eventually. Come back? I visit every few months. Not to visit, Mrs. Emerson said. To stay. The service was small, maybe 20 people, most of them elderly neighbors Daniel barely remembered from childhood visits. The preacher spoke about Cordelia's long life and her devotion to the mountain community, though Daniel suspected the man had never actually met his great-aunt. Cordelia hadn't been inside a church in 30 years. As far as Daniel knew, she'd had her own relationship with whatever forces governed the mountains, and it hadn't required intermediaries or Sunday services. After the burial, people filtered away until only Daniel remained beside the fresh grave. The cemetery sat on a hillside overlooking the valley where Cordelia's cabin still waited, along with all the possessions she'd accumulated over 9 decades of stubborn independence. As her only living relative, Daniel had inherited everything: the cabin, the 40 acres of steep wooded land around it, and whatever mysteries his great-aunt had been keeping all these years. He'd driven up from Charlotte with the intention of spending a few days sorting through her things, then putting the property up for sale. He had a life in the city, a job at a consulting firm, a girlfriend who was already hinting about moving in together, plans for the kind of future that had no room for a fallen-down cabin in the middle of nowhere. But standing in the cemetery as the sun set behind the mountains, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging. The valley spread out below him like a cupped hand, green and secret and somehow familiar, despite the fact that he'd only visited here a handful of times as a child. His mother had been Cordelia's niece, but she'd moved away from the mountains as soon as she graduated high school and never looked back. She'd spoken of the place with a mixture of fondness and relief, as if she'd escaped something that might have claimed her if she'd stayed too long. Daniel had absorbed her ambivalence, treating his childhood visits as adventures to be enjoyed and then forgotten. Now, watching shadows creep across the valley floor, he wondered what his mother had been running from. The drive to Cordelia's cabin took 20 minutes, on winding dirt roads that seemed to exist in a different century from the interstate highway Daniel had left behind in town. No cell service, no power lines, no signs that the modern world had ever penetrated this deep into the mountains. Just forest and stone and the sound of water running somewhere out of sight. The cabin sat in a clearing beside a creek, exactly as Daniel remembered it from his last visit 2 years ago. One story, built from logs that had been cut and fitted with the kind of craftsmanship that died out when power tools replaced hand tools. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and the metal roof showed patches of rust, but the structure was solid. Built to last by people who understood that the mountains demanded permanence from anything that hoped to survive here. Daniel parked beside the cabin and sat in his car for a few minutes, reluctant to go inside. The evening was warm and still, but something about the silence felt expectant, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for him to make the first move in a game whose rules he didn't understand. He finally got out of the car and climbed the porch steps, noting the way the boards creaked under his weight, not with the groan of decay, but with the settled complaint of wood that had been bearing weight for a long time and intended to keep doing so. The front door was unlocked, which didn't surprise him. Cordelia had never believed in locks, claiming that anything worth stealing wouldn't be deterred by hardware store security. The inside of the cabin was exactly as he remembered it, and completely different. The layout was the same, A front room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen separated by a counter, a bedroom and bathroom in the back. But the atmosphere had changed in some fundamental way that Daniel couldn't quite identify. Everything was clean and organized, for one thing. During his previous visits, the cabin had been cluttered with the accumulation of decades, stacks of books and newspapers, boxes of unidentified objects, mason jars filled with things that might have been preserves or might have been something else entirely. Now the surfaces were clear, the floors swept, the dishes washed and put away. It looked like someone had been preparing for his arrival. Daniel set his overnight bag on the kitchen counter and opened the refrigerator, expecting to find spoiled food that would need to be cleaned out. Instead, he found milk that was still fresh, eggs that hadn't passed their expiration date, vegetables that looked like they'd been purchased yesterday. Even the leftovers were still good. A pot of soup that smelled like the vegetable broth Cordelia used to make for him when he was sick as a child. None of this made sense. Cordelia had been dead for over a week. The power hadn't been shut off yet. The refrigerator was still running, but fresh food didn't stay fresh that long, especially not in a refrigerator that was older than Daniel himself. He opened cabinets and drawers, looking for clues, and found them stocked with supplies he was sure hadn't been there 2 years ago. Coffee beans in sealed containers, spices that still smelled potent, flour and sugar in quantities that suggested someone had been planning to do a lot of cooking. As if Cordelia had been preparing to feed someone other than herself. In the bedroom, Daniel found clothes laid out on the bed, work clothes in his exact size, along with boots that looked like they'd fit his feet perfectly. On the nightstand was a handwritten note in Cordelia's familiar spidery script. "Welcome home. We have a lot of work to do." Cordelia had died unexpectedly, alone, with no warning that would have given her time to prepare for his arrival. Even if she had somehow known she was dying, how could she have known he would inherit the cabin? How could she have known that he would come here instead of just hiring someone to clean out the place and arrange for its sale? More importantly, how had she known his clothing size or what kind of work she thought he'd be doing? As if in answer to his question, Daniel heard the sound of footsteps on the front porch. Slow, deliberate steps that creaked on the same boards he'd walked across 20 minutes earlier. He waited for a knock on the door, for a voice calling his name, but the footsteps simply stopped. After a few minutes of silence, Daniel went to the front window and looked out. The porch was empty, but in the dirt beside his car, he could see fresh boot prints that definitely hadn't been there when he'd arrived. The prints led from the woods to the porch steps, then seemed to simply disappear. Daniel opened the front door and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" His voice echoed off the mountains and faded into silence. But just before the echo died completely, he heard something that made his blood freeze. A voice, faint but unmistakable, calling back from somewhere in the forest. It was his own voice saying, "Welcome home, Daniel. We've been waiting." The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the trees and the creek and the mountains themselves. And underneath it, barely audible, he could hear other voices joining in. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all welcoming him back to a place he'd never really left. As Daniel stood in the doorway, listening to the chorus of his own voice echoing through the valley, he finally understood what his mother had been running from all those years ago. And he understood that he wasn't going to be able to run from it himself. The end. Hope you all enjoyed it. Usually my cousin Brian does voiceover for this channel, but this time he asked me. Let me know in the comments if you prefer listening to Brian or me.